Hello, everyone, and first and foremost, happy Halloween to everybody. Happy spooky season, happy gay Christmas. It's a celebration all around. And this video comes about as a result of my constant struggle trying to come up with what to do for today. I was honestly thinking, should I do some kind of like spooky ghost hunting stuff? Should I read one of my favorite horror short stories? Something along those lines. But then eventually I realized, why don't we take it old school? Why don't we bring it back to what started it all, to what started this channel? And the discussion that you all seem to enjoy the most, and that honestly I enjoy the most, which is the most disturbing books out there. We are now on part 6, which is insane, but I mean, we love that, right? And of course, just like with previous installments, following that same format, first I'm going to read off some of you lovely people's comments and suggestions and entries into this compendium of most disturbing books, and then I will follow it up with 5 of my own recommendations, 5 of my own entries into this master list, and then we can discuss further in the comments. I think most of y'all know, but if you're new to the series, basically, you can recommend what you think are the most disturbing books out there, or that you have read, or recommend a book that might not be disturbing to anybody, but was incredibly unsettling to you, and then a little description of why that was. And if that book has not been mentioned in any previous installment, I will include it in the next one. Now, I will say I did not include all the comments that I have received in previous videos. I'm not going to be reading them all in this one, and that is because there was a lot. And last time I read them all off, and that installment was like an hour and a half long, which honestly no one really seemed to mind, and that is incredible. And I appreciate every single one of you, and I love you all for putting up with me and my rambly ass. But nonetheless, I do want to keep it kind of concise, and don't want to go on for too long. But still, some great recommendations that I'm going to read off, and that leaves more for the next installment, of course, and so on and so forth. By the way, I also thought I would mention I did do a kind of spin-off installment of this series where I discussed most disturbing theater performances and plays. And if you haven't checked that one out, of course, I will put that one up there in the annotations. Without further ado, I mean, what else is there to say? You all know what this is about. Don't play. You already know what you're here for. Let's go ahead and get into the viewers' recommendation, the viewer entries, and also a moment of silence for a little ghost dude and little pumpkin girl over here, and my little skull buddies over there. This is probably the last time you're gonna see them, because it is Halloween, and after this they're gonna get tossed into a box where they will slumber until they are once more awakened. And just as I said last time, I am going to be reading viewers' comments, and I will be thanking all of them. Because of course I appreciate all of the engagement, all of the support that you all provide for this channel. The fact that you all are so invested in it is something that continues to astound me. And so apologies in advance if it starts to get a little bit repetitive, because I'm just like, thank you for watching, thank you. That might be a problem for some people, I don't know, but there's no way around it. I want to thank all of these amazing individuals, obviously, because the engagement, the conversations, the constant discussions about disturbing works are what feed me, what keep me going, truly the thing that I'm still alive for. So let's go ahead and get into it. This one comes from Maria Radulovic. Maria says, Eternal Treblinka by Charles Patterson. This one I have read excerpts from because I am working, spoilers, I am working on a video that is going to touch heavily on the subject of animals in literature, and this book specifically is a non-fiction work of social philosophy that grapples with the idea of slaughterhouses and the farming and frenetic consumption of animals, and drawing these very sort of astute, daring, astonishing parallels to human on human atrocities and sort of systemic genocide, specifically the Holocaust, and sort of mirroring how both forms of violence really sort of meet in the middle in exceptional ways when it comes to the psychology when it comes to the motivations, and when it comes to that level of moral desensitization and how it operates. Of course, incredibly controversial. Some people have sung its praises to, as I said, the astute parallels that Patterson is able to draw. Other people are absolutely outraged by the idea of drawing such parallels to such human tragedy as the Holocaust. It kind of what was perceived as a disrespectful or tone deaf manner. I read it. I am somewhere in between. I mean, obviously, I do see that there are parallels in that same kind of systemic operation of violence upon animals as it was in humans. As to the sort of more phenomenological and moral inspirations that sort of catalyzed both of these atrocities. I mean, I'm not the most apt at discussing such a thing, but I will say it's definitely a curious artifact of literature, and as I said, a very daring piece of philosophical work. So I'll definitely say the subject matter and the way that it is treated is very disturbing and disconcerting. So definitely it belongs on this list, and I will be talking more about that whenever I get that other video done. I work at a snail's pace, but I eventually get things done, I promise. But Maria, thank you so much for your comment and for the engagement. Really, really appreciate it. And yes, Eternal Treblinka. I've read some of it, and I concur. I concur with you. All right, up next, so we have TLC, the Learning Channel. And TLC says, thanks for the intro to Matthew Stokoe. Based on his writing style, I'm not only going to read Chaos, which they just read a sample of, and they're in for it. So TLC is my kind of person. But they'll also read Empty Mile by Matthew Stokoe, which I've never read. So that's be interesting to hear what that one's about. So TLC, if you're watching, let me know how that went. Let me know if you're still here after reading Cows, because if you are, that deserves a Congressional Medal of Honor or something like that. And then they go on to say, I recently read the Monstrumologist trilogy by Rick Yancey. Disturbing and amazing, and most importantly, well written. So many themes. I have never heard of this trilogy. The title is certainly compelling. And a trilogy, a series. I believe this might be the first sort of series introduced into this list, which is interesting. And I'd definitely be interested to read up more on what it is about, what's so disturbing about it, and what are the themes that make it so unsettling and unsavory. But all the same, TLC, I'm glad to hear that I drew your interest into Matthew Stokoe. I hope you enjoy Cows and Empty Mile, and again, thank you so much for your comment and your wonderful thoughts on the subject of disturbing literature. Really, really, really appreciate it. All right, up next we have Elizabeth Montour. Forgive me if I mispronounce that. And Elizabeth says, I highly recommend Charles Bukowski's More Notes of a Dirty Old Man, The Uncollected Columns. Definitely not for the transgression shy. Also anything by William Burroughs, but especially his novel The Naked Lunch. It's special. Happy reading, and thanks for the great video. Elizabeth, thank you for your wonderful comment, for your engagement. Really, really appreciate your kind and encouraging words. So Naked Lunch I have spoken about in my most disgusting books video, and there I draw the sort of differences between what makes something disturbing versus disgusting. It's an interesting conversation, but that one Naked Lunch I have moved over to that list. Now, Notes of a Dirty Old Man by Charles Bukowski. I am not a big fan of Charles Bukowski. I have read a lot of his work. I can certainly say that I've given him a try. and I wasn't really a fan. And not really going to get into why that is, but this one I haven't read, so that might be the one. I mean, if it's transgressive, as you say, most of his work sort of flirts with that idea of transgression. Certainly some of it really digs into transgressive subject matter, but none of it I found quite that compelling or interesting, if I'm being honest. But this one might be the one, who knows. But Charles Bukowski, I would say I will allow his presence in this list. Definitely, I mean, he's definitely a very important figure in that sort of more transgressive, unhinged, confessional style of poetry and prose. So definitely, I mean, that's a good catch. I think, yes, Charles Bukowski, definitely belongs on this list. And I will, if I can get a hold of, or if I can read more into what More Notes of a Dirty Old Man is about, and I'm sort of vibing with what it is, maybe I'll check it out. I mean, I don't like giving up on authors completely. I have done that in the past, but if there's another work of theirs that interests me, I'm not gonna be like, well, I've read this and that by them and I didn't like it, so I won't check it out. No, I'll still give it a shot. So thank you, Elizabeth, for your comment, and again, thank you for your kind words, and thank you for watching this series. Really, really appreciate it. All right, moving on. We have Raymond Arvizo. Raymond says, "Hey Juan, I wanted to say I recently became a big fan of the channel. I've enjoyed raw and transgressive literature for a long time, and it's rare to see someone talk about these types of books in detail the way you do. Thank you so much. That means a lot to me. That very kind words from you, and I humbly accept them. Thank you. It's always it's always amazing to hear from other people who really love this stuff and really sort of intelligently approach this stuff, and approach it with a level of nuance and decorum, which is often denied to works like this. So thank you. That is very encouraging to know that I'm not just screaming into a void." And Raymond goes on to say, "I recently picked up Birdman, and the book so far has been a great read. Way more brutal than I thought it was going to be. Seeing the type of books you enjoy, I would highly recommend you take a look into the works of Peter Sotos, specifically Pure Filth, which I think is a fantastic read, so maybe you might enjoy it too. I would also highly recommend the book Girlvert by Ashley Blue. It's a pretty gnarly book about the porn industry and was one of the hardest reads that I've ever done. And I read Hog, so tall order there, Raymond. But thank you so much for your wonderful suggestions. Now, Peter Sotos is somebody who I've been meaning to make a video specifically on. He is such a fascinating and macabre and transgressive figure, sort of like the modern day Desaad. He an incredible story behind his work and his legacy, however you want to see it. Sadly, I haven't been able to sort of find the nice level with which to approach it in a way that's not going to get me removed from YouTube, because he touches on very, very heavy, extremely he's one of the most out there authors in terms of transgression, in terms of just insanity, sheer insanity, and I've been meaning to find a way to sort of approach it in a way that's nuanced, in a way that merits, a sort of more civil discussion. But it's a hard thing to do, especially with YouTube and how heavy it is on censorship. And of course, if YouTube is not an appropriate platform to discuss Peter Sotos, that should let you know that if you're into transgressive fiction, Peter Sotos is somebody that you should look into. But yes, I have read some of his work, and obviously goes without saying, incredibly upsetting in an extremely appalling way, and he definitely, of course, deserves a spot on this list, but I think he also merits a video discussion of his own, and I will provide that for him eventually, somewhere down the line. And then Girlvert by Ashley Blue. I have not read this book or heard of it. It's about the porn industry, and I can understand how that can be very unsettling and disturbing and upsetting. I mean, the sort of almost mechanization of sexual activity, the sheer levels of exploitation, of workers' exploitation, of the exploitation of bodies, both male and female bodies, even, the sort of a constant fetishization of bodies of color, of trans bodies, etc. It's fascinating, macabre topic, I would say, and definitely very interested in that, especially, as you say, if it was a hard read for you, for somebody that read Hog. I have to get into that, don't I? So thank you, Raymond. Always a pleasure to meet other fellow lovers of the transgressive and upsetting. Thank you so much for your comment. Really appreciate it. Thank you. All right, up next we have Tobias K. Toby, the king of extreme horror around these parts. A very good friend of the channel and longtime supporter. Toby says, I've been meaning to read Zombie for a while. This was where I recommended Zombie by Joyce Carol Oates. Fantastic read. And then he goes on to say, it's been on my Kindle waiting for me to get to it. I think the most disturbing book I've read was Along the Path of Torment by Chandler Morrison. It explores some stuff that was very devastating in certain ways. Chandler Morrison, of course, is a very controversial figure around here. I've heard his work be praised and reviled every which way. I've heard things about Dead Inside and now Along the Path of Torment. I mean, definitely kind of more of a taste of extreme horror with him than just straight up transgressive fiction. And I have had my mixed feelings about extreme horror as of now, but I mean, just the sheer amount of polarization that goes on BookTube about his work compels me to want to check it out, because I'm like, where will I fall in this debate? Like, will I be absolutely upset and disturbed, or will I just be like, this is stupid, or will I enjoy it? I don't know. So definitely he is somewhere in my bucket list. I don't know when I'll get to him, but I'm sure I will. But Toby, you already know. You're a homie. Thank you so much for your comment. Really, really appreciate it, man. Thank you. All right, going on to Nathan Isaacson. Nathan says, I love this series of videos, thoughtful, intellectual, and not offering the same predictable entries. Thank you so much. That is the aim. That is the goal. I mean, why can't we have intelligent and nuanced discussion about filth? I think it merits it. It's about time, isn't it? But thank you, Nathan. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate hearing your words. They mean a lot to me. It means that my message is coming across, and I really, really appreciate. And now Nathan goes on to say, try the short story People in Hell Just Want a Drink of Water by Annie Proulx from her short story collection Close Range Wyoming Stories, published in 1999. Thank you so much for that recommendation, Annie Proulx. I have heard the name. I have never read any of her work. I imagine it might be something along, maybe tastes of Southern Gothic, transplanted onto the Midwest, some rural noir. I'm not sure. I'm just making bold and baseless assumptions, which is what we do best here. But I'll definitely keep that in my radar. I mean, it sounds like something I would really enjoy. So we'll see if I ever check that out somewhere down the line. Nathan, I do remember you also left me some other lovely comments in other videos. Really, really appreciate your thoughtful words and supportive words. You are highly, highly cherished presence here on this channel. Thank you. Up next, well, look who's here. Dave from Book Blather. A wonderful friend of the show. We have been BookTube bros for a while. we sort of started around the same time and shout each other out pretty much any chance we get. So check out Book Blather. His videos are incredible. Another thorough reviewer, although we all know Olive is the real star of the show. Now Dave says, hearing you talk about To Train Up a Child, which was my previous installment, made me think of The Water Cure by Sophie McIntosh, which I read last year. It's a truly disturbing tale about a man that tries to shield his wife and daughters from the evils of men by sequestering them on an island where he subjects them to cruel rituals to make them pure and strong. It was longlisted for the Booker Prize and definitely worth a read. Dave, that sounds amazing. I'm definitely going to have to check that out. I had never even heard of it. Shortlisted for the Booker Prize. I mean, the Booker Prize really, well, they use, I don't really know if they still do, but they really used to give it to really fucked up books, and I kind of love that. It's like the one literary award that I can say I've seen attached to some truly fucking unhinged literature. And that's amazing. I don't know if they still do that, but they certainly popped off in previous decades. And the Water Cure sounds incredible. So Dave, thank you for that recommendation. I definitely need to get to that. And it sounds like something that absolutely belongs on a list like this. And of course, like I already said, Dave from Book Blather is a king. He is the kind of wholesome father of disturbing literature that we need around this parts. So go subscribe to Dave. He's amazing. And Dave, I've already said more than enough to you about how much I appreciate you. But I'll say it again. Really, really love and appreciate you, man. Thank you for being here. All right, moving on to Horror and Inconvenience, which is a new-ish BookTube channel. So if you haven't checked her out, definitely do that. And then she says, I look forward to seeing more of this hopefully infinite list. I do hope it's infinite. I do hope we do like part 58 somewhere down the line. And then she says, one topic that always disturbs me is that human cruelty to animals. Sometimes I can't stomach reading about it at all. Watership Down was a no-go for me. However, one disturbing book on the subject that I genuinely love is George Saunders' novella Fox 8. It's written from the point of view of a fox whose home is destroyed by construction near a shopping mall, who has to navigate the human world in order to find a new place to live. Gut-wrenching, but also very funny and empathetic. I highly recommend everything Saunders has ever written, by the way. Now, Fox 8 by Saunders is one that I have read as well. And it is it's sort of told in a more, there's a play with language there. It's a very short book, and it has lovely sort of illustrations. It's meant to be presented as a children's book, but of course, it is kind of a letter to humanity from the imagined perspective of an animal. And there are certainly very intriguing plays with cognition, with sort of that human-animal boundary, and this is another one that I really, really want to touch upon more heavily in that video that I mentioned earlier about animal literature. So definitely, I will say, can totally see why this would be considered disturbing. It really definitely reads as upsetting in some parts, but most of all, very revelatory. Very well written, especially, like I said, with those plays with format and language. Beautifully presented and a very touching book. I will say sort of leaning very heavily towards one side of an argument and moralizing in some way, but I think that's also kind of the point. Unabashedly sort of a moralizing and a call to action, more so than there's a mobilization of ideas above everything else in here, and I did really enjoy it. So yeah, I'll gladly accept a children's style picture book into this list because God knows there's lots and lots of those that could be considered disturbing. By the way, Pax over at Pax Panic, who's another wonderful booktuber, has a series on a creepy, disturbing, and just overall eerie children's books. It's an amazing series. So if you're interested in that, go and check out her channel. And Horror and Inconvenience, thank you so much for that comment, for your wonderful and your long-time support. Really appreciate your presence around here. And everybody go subscribe to go check out her videos. She's great. Thank you so much. Speaking of somebody whose videos you should go and check out and subscribe to and support, Justin, Justin from This Just In is here. Another close friend of the show, a wonderful booktuber, very, very thorough thinker and curator of ideas, and has been really touching upon more horrific works. I would like to say I've maybe had a hand at that, but that's probably just narcissistic part of me thinking. But he does really enjoy horror, and I always, my mission statement is to push every single booktuber I come into contact with to read at least one work of transgressive fiction. And so far I have been succeeding, so go me. But anyway, Justin, wonderful fella, amazing, kind-hearted, intelligent, totally unique. We stan. Needless to say, we stan. Justin says, lots of great stuff here. I love these lists. I'm slowly absorbing this video over a couple of days. Joe R. Lansdale is amazing. Michael K. Vaughan, another wonderful booktuber, of course, introduced me to Lansdale, as he has so many great authors. I can't say that I've found much of his work disturbing, but maybe I have a high tolerance. They're definitely worth your time. His Hap and Leonard crime novels are particularly enjoyable. As a parent, I am terrified of the notion of reading we need to talk about Kevin. In general, books or films with children in danger have a far different effect on me since I became a parent. V.C. Andrews I read in high school, so many years ago, so it's hard for me to comment on the quality, but some very bizarre twisted things occur in those novels. I can only imagine. I've heard things. I've definitely heard things. And then for Justin's suggestion, he says, this may have been covered in another list, but Jerzy Kosinski's controversial novel, The Painted Bird, certainly deserves a spot. It is a fictional story of a very young boy who ends up lost and wandering throughout Eastern Europe during World War II. Through his journey, he witnesses and experiences horrible atrocities committed by residents of the villages he travels through. The abuse he endures is mostly as a result of his dark hair and olive skin color, which caused people to label him as a gypsy or Jew. It is a brutal coming-of-age story set during one of the world's most horrifying periods. It has been a long time since I've read it, but as I recall, there is a beauty to the overall experience of the book, in spite of its disturbing content. Now, Justin, of course, Justin, you already know you are a homie, you are a real one. So I just want to say thank you for such a thorough comment. And again, telling everybody to go and check out his channel, subscribe to him. He is wonderful. He's amazing. He is really cool. Now, The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kosinski is actually one of the titles that you can see most prominently down here on my bookshelf. I have read it, and I have been meaning to talk about it on this list. But of course, Justin, being such an astute reader, beat me to it. But definitely, yes, this belongs in here. It's incredibly upsetting. It's there's been some contention about like the level of horrific depiction of atrocity and whether that's meant to be gratuitous more than sensibly done. But of course, such an argument seems kind of flawed when it comes to such a thorough treatment on grief and trauma. I think those kinds of narratives definitely have to push the envelope and go as far as they can go. It's definitely a shocking and upsetting I read this, I believe, when I was in high school, and I haven't forgotten it since. Definitely it is due for a reread, a grueling and pained reread. It deserves that much. It's a wonderful novel. Yes, extremely disturbing, extremely unsettling, and grueling, and stomach turning, and just all those wonderful things, I guess, that we look for in a list like this. So anyway, thank you, Justin. I really appreciate your comment and your support, and I think hopefully you already know that. All right, so that went on for far longer than I thought it would, but yeah, amazing suggestions, and there were still more that I didn't get to. We are gonna have to stop it right there, but keep them coming in these comments, in the comments of other installments in this series. Just keep them coming. Disturbing books of any kind, even if it's a book that you think only disturbed you, I want to hear about it, and I want to hear about why that was. I adore the subject matter, as you know. It's just my favorite thing to talk about, and I look forward to hearing more and more about these titles and what it is about them that upset you also. And so, without further ado, here is me presenting my 5 entries into this Disturbing Books compendium. Going, of course, as always, not in any kind of level of disturbing. I'm just going alphabetically by author's last name. And yeah, not much else to say. You already know the drill. Let's go ahead and get into it. All right, up first is a work by an author whose works I have covered previously on other occasions. I did a full review of his novel, The Sluts. It merited its own video, and his novel, Frisk, was included as one of my entries in my top 10 most disgusting books video. But here I come to you with a title that was disturbing because of how different it was to those other books, just in terms of the brooding nature of the subject matter, how much more understated it was, but still how impactful, beautifully crafted, and sort of emotionally told it was. Of course, the author I'm talking about is Dennis Cooper, and the novel that I'm going to be presenting as one of my entries for this list is his short novel, My Loose Thread. Now this, first and foremost, I want to say was recommended to me by a viewer, Chris Rooftop. Chris, good old Chris, supporter of the show and practitioner of black magic and the dark arts. We love Chris around here, so thank you so much, Chris, for this suggestion. I did read this recently, and I adored how deep, impactful, and unsettling it was. Now, this was a work by Dennis Cooper that was inspired by what was then, because this was published in 2002. And so back then, of course, a hot topic of discussion in media outlets, in government legislation, in social groups, all kinds of gatherings, the subject of school shootings and the subject of gun violence within schools. Of course, Columbine left in immovable mark on American history. And so this is the novel that Dennis Cooper chose to write in response to all of that heft, all of that monstrosity. And it is crafted as this story about a group of teenagers, particularly this teenager named Larry, who is hired to kill a fellow student in order to retrieve a notebook that he possesses. And he's been paid $500 to do it, but of course things are complicated. Things escalate. Things go out of control, and the nature of what the notebook is, the nature of the violence that is being enacted, all of that is beautifully and unflinchingly explored here. And I say beautifully because Dennis Cooper possesses this weird gift to really treat the ugliest, most disgusting and foul and sinister subject matter with such poise, with such humanity, that really feels like poetry, a poetic treatment of atrocity, of a kind that I've hardly ever read or seen any other author manage to do. And that is something that I also noticed in his works, Closer and Frisk, and of course The Sluts. He is finally tuned into what humanity is about, and the nature, the heaviness behind those lashings out, that kind of violence that bursts out. It is an incredible work. As you can see, it is very short, but it contains just enough detail, just enough sort of weirdly mind-turning dialogue and situations that are tense. There is a tension. There is a sort of more conventional authorial conceit with things like, rising action and thrills and stuff like that. But that is hardly the focus of it. I mean, I think most of it is intent on exploring these dark psychologies from a purely humanistic perspective. And usually when you see a treatment of something that is humanistic, you would think that it leans more on the sentimental side or the moralizing side. But I think that is what's so fascinating about Dennis Cooper, is that the humanistic nature of his writing is what turns it uglier, is what turns it even more perverse and sort of unwieldy and difficult to cope with. And this was no exception. I mean, in terms of graphic depictions, there's certainly been heavier stuff that I read in Frisk and The Sluts. This is much more pulled back in terms of actual explicit violence being told. But the violence here, it's not that it's absent, it's just that it takes other forms. It takes the form of its constant looming and immovable presence in human interaction. And I think those kinds of more subdued, almost invisible violence are the ones that stick out the most, and the ones that haunt the mind the most, because you can see how violence operates pretty much in every sort of interpersonal interaction that goes on in this book. And the violence is just so disquieting and ugly and upsetting, and it's really, really, really in tune with this kind of strictly American tragedy about misguided youth, about this pent-up rage, about this need to lash out, about this need to leave a mark. It's incredible, incredibly profound. Definitely, of course, as with every book on this list, not for everybody, but he is a masterful author, somebody who really knows how to treat humanity through fiction in such compelling and unforgettable ways. And this was no exception. I absolutely adored this book. I'm looking forward to reading more and more by Dennis Cooper. But in terms of disturbing, in terms of the dark psychology, in terms of something that's truly haunting in an insidious and sort of a mind-turning way, I would say that this is the way to go with Dennis Cooper. And it's a nice entry. Like I said, it's more subdued than his other works. So if you enjoy this, definitely keep going with Dennis Cooper, because he is a writer whose works, I assure you, you will be unable to forget the more and more you get into them. And up next, my next entry into this list is a book that, curiously enough, has a blurb by Dennis Cooper. It says, meticulous, violent, delicate, awe-inspiring. And those are some high words from the master of the meticulous, violent, delicate, and awe-inspiring. and those high praises are for Left Hand by Paul Curran. Paul Curran or Paul Curran. My apologies if I'm mispronouncing that. Now, this book, first of all, is a work of experimental fiction. As you can see, large chunks of it are done in lists. And that is one of the things that I want to touch upon the most when it comes to this work, is that it really seems to draw out sort of paint this disturbing portrait, sort of becomes disturbing because of its form. And when a book can make its form disturbing, that is a job incredibly well done and definitely merits a spot on this list. Now, what is this book about? I can't really tell you. It's not about anything. It's just a series of literally, I've used the term laundry list of atrocity to describe sort of exploitative and extreme works of horror. This is literally a laundry list of atrocities. There is kind of a loose thread of plot somewhere in there. There's obsessions with sex, with drugs, with deviancy. Those are the themes that sort of run most prominently throughout. But as far as a straight story being told, that's not really what we have here. And I have to say, going back to the form of it, reading constant, endless, relentless lists of atrocities, there's just so much of it. And I guess I can try to read you one of them. I'll read you the first one, and you can see what I am talking about. So this is 1.1. A. Perch with your feet on either side of the bathtub. B. Stare at your cock getting hard through the rising steam. C. Hear your lungs sucking in the most air they can. D. Exhale and then thrust your mouth down at your cock. E. Slip under the water, hitting your head and pass out. That is, of course, hilarious, but it's also just this mental image that sort of runs very smoothly, even though it's not florid, even though it's not concerned with any level of detail. Really, it's just kind of from point A to point B, literally. But there's something about the way that images are constantly being seared into your mind that makes this book a really compelling, almost sort of psychic attack, I would say, because it's running through very vivid, very easily imaginable scenarios that contain violence, that contain unhinged levels of depravity, and it only sort of get progressively worse. It is kind of like this ripple effect of atrocity becoming darker and darker and darker. And then we do get moments of prose, but even those are even more unhinged. I mean, you would think that in a work of experimental literature where the format is so unconventional, you would latch onto these longer, sort of more conventional passages of straight up prose, but those don't even allow any kind of breathing room for you to for you to feel more comforted. But what we have here is just endless, constant torment. And I gotta say, it was one of the most unique reading experiences that I have ever undertaken. It is kind of a mixed feeling in terms of it does get exhausting. It's not an enjoyable read, but I mean, it's a list of most disturbing books. Do we ever really have enjoyable reads around here? It's not enjoyable, but it is fascinating. It is haunting, and there is so much of it that there is a dedication to the format that really makes me think Karan is an amazing author, because there's just no end to the images that are so tethered to reality. Like I said, they're easily imaginable, but they get progressively worse, and the mental state of the narrative itself sort of deteriorates. It's a way in which almost even writing becomes insane. It's an insane sort of writing. You can feel like the book itself is losing its sanity, and that's quite an amazing feat. When even form deteriorates and doesn't allow for any kind of anchoring to that comfortable space for writing that we're used to. It's an amazing thing to behold, and also very, very graphic depictions of violence sort of tied all together. And as Dennis Cooper says, and I agree, yes, meticulous and violent, but awe-inspiring in its endeavor. And it's certainly something that's not for everybody at all, but for those few of you who are weird enough to try it, I think you will find it is an incredible and sort of moving, just in terms of the craft of writing that is dedicated here. But it will leave you, I think, wanting a shower, and that's perfectly fine. I love being left with that icky feeling when I read, and I suspect a lot of you are as well. So that is Left Hand by Paul Ceran. Now, up next is another book that I read recently, and this is the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, and perhaps one of the most controversial Nobel Prize laureates. This is The Piano Teacher by Elfriede Jelinek, and I apologize if I didn't pronounce that correctly. Now, this has been adapted into a film, a very famous film. I believe it has even recently gotten the Criterion Collection treatment. So a very highly praised but very polarizing piece of literature that we have here. Now, the Piano Teacher is, of course, about Erica, who is a piano teacher. This is a novel that is set in Vienna, and it follows Erica as this very sort of isolated figure. And I gotta say, the isolation of it both physical but also mental, I think most prominently a mental kind of isolation that we have here, was just so impactful and so unforgettable. It's Erica, who is this very lonely woman who lives with her mother, is in constant battle, in constant sort of psychological warfare with her mother, and she eventually develops a fixation with one of her very much younger piano students, and the two develop this very sick dynamic in which they're kind of thrown into passion, but at the same time, through that passion, through that love, quote unquote, they are exploring each other's limits, psychological and physical limits, in the most unsettling and upsetting ways. And a lot of it is very sort of sparsely told. It's very sort of straightforward kind of prose that doesn't really leave anything to the imagination. And also the like I said, the insular aspect of it is what's most compelling about it. I truly felt like it was one of the most accurate sort of dives into a dark and deteriorating psychology that I have ever read. And of course, I can't say that I enjoyed that at all. I mean, there's no sort of rhyme or reason to anything, and this book has been largely reviled by a lot of people. It's seen as, it made a joke out of the Nobel Prize. How dare they decorate such schlocky trash with such a prestigious award? There's a lot of contention in here, but I can totally see the literary merits of something like this, because it is a tale about an experience that feels heavy. And the heaviness of literature is something that is very, very difficult to capture, but nonetheless, we see it fully here. And it is a heaviness that is sort of interspersed with very brief but appalling moments of graphic violence. For example, there's a sort of droning meditative aspect to it that feels almost kind of, you're very uneventful, even boring, just because of how slow it is, where Erica is recounting a time in her childhood where she had a visit from a male cousin who got all the praise from the family, and of course she was ignored because she was expected to be this proper artistically driven woman, and she sort of envied the kind of liberation that her male cousin enjoyed as opposed to her, and it's told without any kind of like I said, florid prose or any kind of even introspective approach. It's just kind of being told beat by beat, and then by the end of that anecdote, we get a brief but powerful scene in which Erica slit her wrists open after having witnessed such unfair treatment of her own body, of her own person, as contrasted with that of her male cousin. And that brief glimpse into that sort of bodily undoing is something that is hard to forget. And I think it only works, it's only exacerbated by those droning passages, by this constant sort of psychological torment, by this constant sort of a psychological isolation that we see here. It was an incredible book. I can't, of course, again, I sound like a broken record, but I can't say I enjoyed it. But I appreciate it, and I was fascinated by it, and I thought that it was an honest work, and the honesty in it. Honesty is something that gets a lot of mixed feelings around the subject of literature. It is often seen as, an author's best aim is to be honest with themselves and write about things that they know and they that are near and true to their hearts. But honesty is seen as like this very moral and commendable quality. But what a lot of people don't understand is that honesty can also be incredibly ugly, incredibly upsetting, incredibly monstrous. And the honesty here with, the image that Erica has for herself as a woman, as this kind of as a body, as somebody who finds no sort of release, that is constantly haunted by the limitations of what should otherwise be sort of liberating artistic expression, and so on and so forth. There's just so much heaviness to it that feels unflinching, that feels uncomfortably close. Uncomfortably close, I think, is the best way to describe this book. I thought it was phenomenal. I did end up giving it 3 stars. Wait, this isn't a book review. I'm sorry, but yeah, I gave it 3 stars because um, it's kind of like that kind of situation where I can't really say I recommend it. Definitely not for everybody at all, but there is something in it that is just so compelling and hard to ignore. And it is a book that sort of screams with fury at you. And those, screams of fury are seldom ever ignored. And that kind of literature can lead to powerful revelations. And so I appreciated it at that level. If you think that you would vibe well with what we have here, definitely pick it up. But Jelinek Piano Teacher absolutely 100% deserves a spot on this list. And now from Vienna, we move to Mexico. And here we have a super, super short work by one of the most sort of controversial and also celebrated figures in Mexican literature. And I'm going to be telling you about El Apando by Jose Revueltas. And this has been actually very recently translated into English as The Whole. Now, Jose Revueltas, like I said, is a very controversial figure in the literary history of Mexico. He was somebody who was really speaking to an honest truth about the sociopolitical climate of Mexico back in sort of like the earlier decades of the 20th century, and all the way down to around the middle of the 20th century, where, for those of you who don't know, an extremely tragic event known as the Tlatelolco massacre unfolded. And in this massacre, university students who were protesting against oppressive governmental rulings, against economic distress, against the poor treatment of agricultural workers in Mexico, and so on and so forth. Just an overall level of discontent, galvanized by all of these, constant sort of revolutionary movements that were taking over the world in general around this time. Highly inspired by movements somewhere in Europe, of course, the protests against Vietnam in the U.S. Moved these students to protest, especially because Mexico was holding the Olympics that very year in 1968, was hosting the Olympics, and in order for all these protests, all this civil unrest to not interfere with the Olympics, under orders from the government of Mexico, military personnel was sent out onto campus to brutally massacre hundreds and hundreds of university students to sort of quash the protests once and for all. The reason I'm giving you this historical background because Jose Revueltas was seen as a literary figure who was sort of, fanning the flames of this revolution. And indeed, Jose Revueltas was imprisoned, heavily censored and imprisoned. Censorship and silencing of the press, silencing of the arts is a very, very prominent problem in Mexico, for those of you who didn't know. And like I said, Jose Revueltas was imprisoned. And while he was in prison, in this sort of very isolated and cruelly treated, he was imprisoned in this infamous sort of known as like the Dark Castle, this infamous prison known as Lecumberri. And in Lecumberri, in his experiences in that prison, once having been released, or actually I believe while he was in prison, he wrote El Apando. And this is a work, like I said, very extremely short, very, very short. And it is, I would describe it not so much as a story, not so much as a novel. It's more of a texture. I think texture is the most accurate word for it. It is a tapestry of these sort of rich and flowery personalities that are nonetheless isolated, and in the way that Jose Revueltas describes the prison, they are sort of disembodied in a way. We have sort of echoing voices without any sort of physical tethering, and the way that Jose Revueltas writes about the dehumanization at the hands of a prison system. The dehumanization at the hands of authority is just so undeniably powerful and extremely disturbing, and there's something about that very subject matter of being treated as something subhuman, and the literature that emerges from those subhuman inhuman voices as they are perceived leads to some amazing artistic revelations. What are the limits of human expression when humanity itself is denied, to its artists. It is just so moving. It comes from such a uh, tragic, heavy, and infuriating injury right in the middle of Mexican history. Jose Revueltas was writing about injustice in a way that didn't seem romantic, or it didn't even seem mobilized or politicized. It was just kind of a steady and gripping, but also in a way passive voice, coming from, like I said, injury, coming from trauma, coming from dehumanization, and it's just so an undeniable masterpiece. I definitely recommend it if you're interested in this part of Mexican history. Of course, it is essential reading, but also if you're interested in seeing in those methods in which humanity is sort of denied, it sort of takes a plunge, and is replaced instead by disembodied voices, by echoing and brooding thoughts. It is an incredible thing to behold. And is an amazing work of art that I have read multiple times. And Jose Revueltas, his bibliography in general, I thoroughly recommend. So, yeah, heavy stuff. And now for my final recommendation, I am going to tell you about On the Beach by Nevil Shute. Now, this is a post-apocalyptic novel, and it is set in Australia. It is set in Australia in a nuclear apocalypse after the fictional World War III has transpired, and it follows this crew traversing through a submarine. They are sort of the last remnants of humanity around, and they are trying to find out the source of this Morse code signal that is emerging from somewhere in the U.S. So it's sort of a travel novel in a way, but it is a travel through what, of course, can only be described as this unthinkable hellscape that nonetheless Nevil Shute unflinchingly writes about. We have, these constant descriptions, of course, of this imperfect and also, what's the word I'm looking for? Unheroic, very normal, quotidian life. It is not a story of heroism, not in the sense that you have like these formidable and powerful characters. It is a story about this very fragile, last thread of humanity that is traversing a world that is no longer welcoming, that is no longer sheltering, and it is a tale of desperation. It is a tale of hanging on to hope. Hope is a prominent theme here, but of course that hope is incredibly anemic and sort of on its dying breaths, and just a fascinating sort of panorama that Nevil Shute portrays here. It's something that has to be read in order to be understood just how impactful it was. Reading about these people who are afraid, most of all, they are uncertain, and there are questions even here of like, what is the point of going on? So a kind of theme that is also touched upon in a book like We Who Are About to by Joanna Russ. It's these desperate sort of last pangs of humanity to try to hold on to that sense of humanity, to try to hold on to these conventions of civilization, and try to continue them, but also this question of, well, what is the point when everything is so derelict, when everything is so unstable, when there's really nothing else to look forward to? Just the bleakness of this novel is absolutely unbelievable. There is just an absolute lack of anything warm. Everything feels very cold. Everything feels, very ghostly in a way that, just really depicts, and the kind of dark imagination that goes into it. Like I said, Nevil Shute did a fantastic job imagining a world where humanity is no longer the center of existence, and how the world goes on, in very interesting ways, how the world doesn't wait for humanity, and how humanity might be holding on to things, that might be just much too comfortable, much too lodged in a kind of shelter that is temporary and also fragile. And constant explorations of failing psychology, of failing hope, the dying of hope. There are constant passages that sort of pine for hope, and the hope, I won't spoil whether it's delivered or not, but that hope feels like it only dies more and more the more they traverse through this hellscape, as I described it. And it is something so grueling, and of course post-apocalyptic fiction in general tends to be the darker side of imagination that really deals with these concepts of the end of the line, the end of humanity. What would that look like? And it places you in that situation. It makes you ask yourself, well, what would I do in that situation? Could I ever possibly survive? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question that a lot of people sort of even shy away from, but that this book asks prominently, is, would I want to survive? And why is that? So absolutely, as far as post-apocalyptic novels go, this is one of the most disturbing and upsetting, and one of the most, I guess, also realistically told, because it's told, through that level of more, regular humanity. Like I said, it's just a group of people who are confused, are scared, and they don't know what they're going to do from here on. And then all of those situations, of course, are hair raising and stomach churning. And I do recommend this thoroughly. For any fans of post-apocalyptic fiction, this is something different. This is something less heroic and much more bleak and depressing. So have fun. And so those are my 5 recommendations, along, of course, with all of the other beautiful recommendations that you all sent my way that I already mentioned. That is it for this installment. Again, thank you all so much for the constant support, for the constant engagement. I appreciate every single one of you so much. Have a happy Halloween. Go celebrate. Eat some candy. Make out with a pumpkin. Whatever you got to do. Just get in the spirit. I hope you enjoyed this. And of course, in the comments, as always, leave more suggestions. Leave your own disturbing books. What has disturbed you? What has ruined your day? I want to hear about it. I really do. All right. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you're all well. Continue to stay safe, and onward to November.